right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Topical Minds podcast. I am extremely excited to have my next guest on. Amr Addas is adjunct professor and director of the Van Berkom Investment Management Program and Van Berkom Small Cap Case Competition at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University in Montreal. He is also the academic director for sustainability at JMSB and leads Concordia Sustainable Investing Practicum in collaboration with Manulife. He is also a member of the faculty for the Sustainable Investment Professional Certificate offered by the John Molson School of Business. In addition to his academic work, Amr also offers consulting services to portfolio managers at Scotia Wealth Management and sustainable investing training to corporate clients as well as financial institutions. So welcome, Amr. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. And actually, for those who don't know, I actually had the opportunity to take your course on sustainable investing, and it was eye-opening to say the least. So extremely excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Abdullah. That's a very kind of you and a kind introduction. It was a pleasure to have you in the course. It's nice to reconnect. You were certainly one of the more active people in the course, and you brought really insightful perspective and contributed very positively to the class. So I'm happy to reconnect with you and to have this conversation about climate and about sustainable investing, because it's urgent and it's important and it's critical.
Exactly. And there's many topics that I'd like to discuss today, but I'd like to start off with the IPCC report. And for those who don't know, the IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was essentially established by the UN to assess climate change science. And what we saw recently come out of the IPCC is a report essentially that provides people with a view on what has already happened and what may happen in the future to where they live. So a lot of really insightful takeaways came out of the report, and I'd like to go into some of those. But some of the things that I think perhaps might just be beneficial to provide before we get into it to the audience is, we've got several takeaways coming out of this report. Humans are without question driving global warming. You've seen a significant and rapid rise in greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to ask you, Amr, what would you say stood out to you, if anything? Just because you're so close to it, was there anything that stood out, or were you just like, well, this was sort of expected?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, maybe just to put some more color to it. This is not, it's not a kind of the first time that the IPCC has said much of what it has said. This is the what's called the sixth assessment report, right? So it's called AR6 in the jargon. It's they've been at this for a couple of decades now or more, and so the approach that they take is very scientific, and it's really extremely rigorous, and so it really completely succeeds, in my view, in debunking any kind of alternative views, right? So I think at this point, one thing we have to accept is that any debate about whether climate change is happening and whether it is caused by human activity, that debate is over. So that to me is one thing to take away from it. Was I surprised? I guess not really. I mean, much of this has been building up, and it's something that we live every day, right? You'd have to be completely isolated from the world to not be seeing what's happening around the world in terms of manifestations of climate change. So I guess maybe the one surprise I would say is, if you dig through. Obviously, I did not read the 4,000 pages, and anybody who says that they did is probably exaggerating. But I did read the summary for policymakers, which is 40 pages, and it's actually the outcome of a discussion between the scientists and policymakers. So it's signed off on by those 195 governments. so that's, I'd say, one of the two things that really kind of I felt were important. One is that we don't really have at this point any government that is trying to dispute or roll back the consensus of scientists, especially now that there's a sane U.S. administration in place. And the second aspect is that, if you dig under all the kind of warnings and so on, which I guess, someone like me who's been reading this stuff for a long time might have, gotten used to in a way, not desensitized, but certainly, used to it. So it doesn't surprise me anymore. But more that that there was an optimistic undertone, that essentially the report concluded that it's not too late, right? And
Yep.
If we put in place the policies that are needed today, not in 2040 or 2050, but this decade, right? That's the key. Then we have a decent shot at success. And of course, success here doesn't mean reversing climate change. It means limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees, which in itself is devastating.
Yep.
Given that we've warmed by about 1.1 so far, which varies across the globe, right? But
Yep.
in Canada, it's about 1.7 actually, because much of the warming takes place further up north. So in that sense, yeah, it kind of clearly shows a path. There are a number of scenarios outlined in the report, 5, I believe, and one of them, a couple of them actually, are quite achievable if with a big if, policies are put in place, right? And that's why this is such a critical time in my view.
There were two things that stood out to me, and they're both related to what you just spoke about. The first thing that I would like for you to just expand a little bit more on is you mentioned this tone of optimism. And you had also recently shared an article that said if you can control methane, then really you might be able to, we may go a long way in actually solving for some of the global warming problems. I wanted to get into that. So GHG, when we think about that, there's many different contributors. There's carbon being the largest contributor, but we've also got methane and we've also got nitrous oxide. I'd like for you to speak a little bit about controlling the methane component. I was reading somewhere that apparently it's a lot more efficient in conserving heat, but it doesn't linger as long in the environment. So you could potentially, in the short term, if you could curb those emissions, it could go a long way. The second thing I wanted to speak or get your thoughts on is we always hear about this 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level stat. Why is it 1.5 to begin with? Isn't that already on its own a dangerously high level? Or is that something that they were like, this could be achievable, so let's just set it at that?
Sure. Yeah, but both are great questions. On the first one, yes, you're right. Methane essentially is far more potent as a warming gas than carbon. The estimates vary, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 times as much, right? Meaning 1 ton of methane is equivalent to 25 tons of carbon.
Wow.
Carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere on average for about a century, whereas methane stays in the atmosphere for only 10 years, which means, what we have to remember when we think about climate is if we stop emissions completely tomorrow, which is obviously not going to happen, but if we do, that's not going to reverse the change in climate, because you have that built up carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, right? So whatever we do now will show itself down the line, and so one of the things that we can do is to curb methane emissions. Why is that important? First, because they're so potent, and second, because if we curb methane emissions now, then we can have rapid results, as opposed to carbon, which, yes, its volume is much bigger, but its effect lingers for much longer, right? So even if we reverse carbon emissions today, unless we have some sort of negative absorption of carbon, which at the time we can't really achieve at scale. The technology exists, but has not been scaled yet at scale and at economically. So methane is a low-hanging fruit in that sense. One, because of its potency. Second, because it actually makes economic sense. because it has value, right? So much of the main two sources of methane emissions come from leakage, unintentional leakage from oil and gas extraction, the pipeline process, from taking it out of the ground until it's shipped to the refinery. There's much leakage that takes place. Of course, methane is invisible, so don't actually see it. And the other source of and so you can sell it, right? So it's an ingredient in natural gas, so you can actually sell it and make money from it. So if you reduce the lost, or kind of unintentional emissions, then you make money from it, or reduce costs. And of course, that's where governments play a role, right? They should impose restrictions on or penalties for companies not making sure to control their lost methane, or to control their methane emissions. The second source, of course, is from agriculture, from livestock. That also is encouraging in what we see in terms of plant-based food, right? And the increased awareness, I think, among many people of eating healthier. So it comes both with the purpose of eating healthier and with awareness of the impact of livestock, in particular cows, right? Which is a major source. So in that sense, yeah, I think there's an very strong economic case and a very strong scientific case to be made for methane emissions. On your second question, on the 1.5 degrees, I mean, look, the reality is that's the best you can do, right? And you can't really do any better at this point. Even 1.5 is an ambitious target given where we are today. But yeah, it's 1.5 would be devastating. You're talking about something like 70 to 90% of coral reefs bleaching and essentially dying. You're talking about the current heat waves that we see, deadly heat waves, wildfires, droughts, superstorms, right? Intensive monsoon in South Asia, and in some cases no monsoon, or shifting of the coverage. You're talking about effects that, in the best case scenario, will manifest themselves and will be devastating to many millions of people, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people. Forced migrations, loss of livelihood, inability to continue to live off the land in many parts of the world where that's key to living. So the reason we have 1.5 is simply because we're so far down this rabbit hole that we can't realistically achieve any better with the technology that we have today.
Right. Before we get into some of the technology, when it comes to carbon sinks, so you mentioned these extreme weather events happening more frequently and causing widespread destruction. When we think about carbon sinks, I was reading somewhere that forests and other sources, there's also, I believe there's blue carbon, which is the which is like the mangroves and the underwater marshes, etc. But I was reading somewhere that these are being saturated. Does that mean that these have a capacity that they're sort of at the level of reaching, or what is causing that saturation?
Well, I mean, I do understand the science of climate change, but I'm not an expert on the cause of saturation. What I do know is that scientists are concerned. They actually don't know exactly what that saturation level is, or whether it exists, but they are very concerned that it might, and it's both what you mentioned about the ability of those mangroves and other types of blue carbon to absorb, and also what a lot of people don't realize is that the ocean itself is a major carbon sink, right? So it's not just the plants that live in the ocean; it's the ocean itself, right?
Oh wow. Okay.
So you have, of course, those blue carbon mangroves and things like what we call phytoplankton, which is actually a major source of oxygen production, and we don't know what would happen to it should coral reefs die en masse, which they're likely to. Then you're looking at the potential breakdown of the ecosystem of the ocean, right? So it's really, those tiny fish feed on the corals. The medium fish eat the small fish, and the big fish eat the medium fish, and so on.
Yeah.
And so, if the corals die at a large scale, then we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. We know it's not going to be good, right? So the ability of the ocean to continue to absorb carbon is in question, given that acidification has increased. And there have been, various models and so on scientifically to try to assess to what extent is there a tipping point at which the ocean will lose its ability or at least weaken its capacity to absorb carbon. We don't know yet for sure, but there's definitely a concern. And the same thing with rainforests, especially in the Amazon. We are approaching fast a tipping point, especially today in Brazil. We have unfortunately, a government that seems to be doing its best to accelerate deforestation.
Right.
And there's very serious concern that if we reach a tipping point, then the Amazon is beyond salvation, and that's of course a major carbon sink globally.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think about it, especially with the importance being given to methane, like if you think about the Amazon rainforest, there's deforestation, so you're cutting off all of these sources of trees that are producing oxygen. But then what you're replacing the trees with is essentially areas where you have livestock. And a lot of these areas are actually being used for cows, as you mentioned, right? And cows are one of the major sources of methane production. So it's sort of like a double impact where like you're reducing the oxygen in the environment and you're also contributing to increased methane production. That's
right. So it's not just the loss of the trees; it's actually that the replacement increases emissions. That's obviously very unfortunate.
What are your thoughts on geoengineering? I, having lived in Dubai for the longest time, we would always hear of cloud seeding. Abu Dhabi essentially using cloud seeding as a way to cool the Emirate down by bringing that rain in. How exactly does that work? Do you essentially just charge particles in the atmosphere to retain precipitation? How exactly does that work exactly?
Well, I mean, there are different types of geoengineering. I think the term generally refers to essentially messing with with the weather system, right, or messing with the atmosphere in some way.
Yeah.
That extent of messing varies. But what we're talking about in terms of geoengineering is not about cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is an older technology, like you said, has been used by different governments. It was used by China during the Olympics, and it's used in the Gulf, like you said. But that is not really what we're referring to when it comes to geoengineering. When it comes to dealing with the climate, right? It's more about trying to seed into some level of the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere mostly, some kind of gas or gases that would deflect sunlight away from the Earth in order to reduce absorption. So theoretically it works, but there are problems associated with it. One is it's never been tried at scale. Second is the modeling suggests that the amount of seeding that would need to take place would have to happen at a global level, and you would essentially have to have a fleet of airplanes flying 24/7 constantly doing the seeding. So the scale of what is needed in order to achieve that is massive. No, I think it would be imprudent to dismiss it, because we may get to the point, we probably will at some point get there where we have to resort to these types of extreme measures. The concerns that a lot of experts on this area have is that if this becomes a viable solution, that takes away the incentive to actually curb carbon emissions, right? So it becomes
right.
It's like a permanent band-aid, right? You're going to rely on it forever, because you're not reducing your emissions, right? So if we ever get to that point, it has to be as a bridge, if you will, right? As we, massively reduce emissions, but we also need some negative emissions, and we engage in this kind of geoengineering to do so. But as I said, we're probably looking at years, if not a decade or two of studies before anything like that happens, and it would require global cooperation. If you look at the political landscape in the world today, not exactly conducive to this sort of cooperation at all. So yeah, I think, and if you read the IPCC recommendations, also they're not ruling it out, but they're not diving deep into it either, right? So they're sort of referring to it, but it's not something that's considered part of the policy mix or recommendations for policymakers at this point. It's not part of the 5 scenarios that they lay out. But I will not be surprised. I would not be surprised to see it being given more space in the next, or in the AR7 or 8, down the line.
Right.
Because as time passes, you look every year or so, you read every year pretty much, you read reports that say last year was the warmest in X, 200 years or whatever, or the last 10 years were the warmest 10 years ever, and so on, right? But I think what a lot of people don't think about is that this year is going to be the coldest for the rest of our lives, right? Or one of the coldest years in the rest of our lives.
That's very true.
So what we're seeing in terms of the manifestations of climate change are just going to get worse, right? So this stuff is not going to disappear. And so as we get to these realities, you might see governments spurred on to take more drastic action, and geoengineering might be one of those.
And when we think about negative emissions technologies, are there in your mind any that are viable? You mentioned that there are a few, but they can't necessarily be used at scale. But are there any to your mind that come where you feel, this could potentially be something where this could be a long-term solution that would really help us keep our temperature down?
Yeah, I mean, there are companies. There's one in British Columbia, I believe, called Carbon Engineering, that actually has, it's kind of a fan that spins, and as it spins, physically removes carbon from the air.
Wow.
The problem is that its output is very low compared to we emit 40 gigatons of carbon, give or take, every year. You're talking about something in the order of like 1 ton.
Okay, so it's
so
you were nowhere. Yeah, okay.
So that's what I mean by scaling, right? The technology as it exists today is very, very infant, and needs to be developed further. There is a lot of effort obviously going into that, and there's money, and there's an economic case to be made for that, right? Because you have carbon pricing is increasingly available around the world, and or prevalent around the world, and if you can have a machine that would actually remove carbon from the atmosphere, you can make money from it if it's economical and scalable, right? So I think that's going to continue, but we're not there yet. We're not close to that. And one of the interesting things also that you see with this kind of geoengineering talk and so on, one of the chemicals that actually cause very serious health problems and kill millions of people a year is sulfur dioxide, and that's it comes from emissions of bunker fuel from ships, and it's kind of like the worst quality oil, right, or oil product, right? So it's mostly bunker fuel from ships and trucks and so on. So that causes health problems. When people breathe it, it causes severe lung damage and so on. But it's a cooling gas, right? So it actually has mitigated by a massive. And this is actually one of the things I should have mentioned to you earlier in your question about what surprised me. I wasn't aware of the extent of cooling that sulfur causes. without this gas, the planet would have already warmed by more than by 0.5 degrees more than it has so far.
Oh,
So
wow.
instead of, let's say, 1.1, it would have been 1.6 had this sulfur not existed. So that's a problem because it's now being regulated, especially in bunker fuel and ships, that container ships and the oil tankers and so on,
Right.
are now required to either scrub the sulfur from their exhaust, or use cleaner type of fuel, which does not contain this kind of sulfur.
Right.
And so that's good for human health, but it actually results in warming, inadvertent warming.
Yeah.
So that's the reason I brought this up is on geoengineering. One of the potential scientific solutions is to seed it at a high into the stratosphere,
right,
in a way that it doesn't penetrate the Earth or our atmosphere,
exactly,
but has that cooling effect. So it hasn't been tried, but it's apparently one of the things they're looking at.
And how, I would imagine for that to work, you would have to produce it at scale and then release it high up into the atmosphere. But as of right now, you mentioned one of the sources. Is the main source the it being produced through the exhausts of these ships? Is that the main source?
Yeah, that's basically the main source. So yeah, it's a good question. You would have to, I guess, produce it explicitly for that purpose. It goes in as an ingredient in certain chemical products, bleach and so on.
Right.
But the main source is emissions from exhaust. Yeah. So it can be produced. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not that familiar with its economics and so on. Can we do it
Yeah.
affordably and so on? Not sure, but something to. It may not be the only cooling agent that can do this job. Others could do it as well. But the fact is, because we're reducing its emissions as a result of these policies to sort of clean up regional pollution,
Yeah.
we're inadvertently causing further warming.
Would you say, now that I think about it, it seems as though, and perhaps perhaps I just wasn't aware, but like thinking back to 2019 when we took the course, would you say that a lot has changed more for the better since then, or would you say it's just been more of a a sad story? It seems to me as though there's a lot more optimism. There's all these different things we can do to cool the planet down. We just need to investigate these a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's a mix. It's probably a mix of the two. I mean, when it comes to policy, for example, yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot more. You see a lot less noise from certain types of politicians trying to make the claim that climate change is not real, or that climate change is real but it's not man-made. Right? Yeah. You're seeing fewer and fewer of these politicians around. Right? They've kind of done the math and went to their focus groups. They probably didn't really say what they mean anyway. Right? They're just saying what they think their audience wants to hear. And so I think in that sense, that is definitely a positive, is that you see a lot more, I mean, first, awareness among the population and voters and concern about climate change, as it becomes clear that it's not a problem to worry about for our grandchildren or great grandchildren, that it's here. It's a clear and present reality. It's already happening to us everywhere, right? And no country is immune. It's not only going to affect developing countries. It's it's affecting the west coast of Canada is burning, and the United States, right? Greece and Italy and all around the Mediterranean, it's burning, right? So everyone's going to be affected in some way. So that, I think that reality has dawned. In that sense, that's very positive.
Yeah.
I guess the reason I'm hesitating a bit is that within the space itself of the business side of climate, the sustainability aspect, you've seen a lot of positives, right, and a lot of noise that's kind of saying the right thing, but it also means that we're also, as we scrutinize things that corporate leaders say and claim to do, we realize that we really have to see more what they do rather than what they say they do.
Exactly. So are they walking the walk instead of just talking the talk, essentially, right?
Exactly. That's it. And that's where things are, a bit less, clear. They're a bit grayer, I would say.
Right. That's a really good point. And coming back to the report, I think one of the really good aspects of the report is it does exactly what you mentioned. It tells you exactly what will or what may happen to you depending on where you're living, the kinds of events, the kinds of the problems that you might face. We're all Greece, you mentioned horrible wildfires, right? Like we're starting to see these events take place and unfold that in terms of the scale and magnitude of the issue, it's quite frightening. British Columbia has been struggling with it for the longest time. You mentioned, super thunderstorms, super storms starting to hit more frequently. And I think this report does well in the sense that it shows you, look, irrespective of where you are, you're facing something or the other. So we might as well just get together and try and solve this as soon as possible. One of the things I'd like to get into now is sustainable investing. Sustainable investing is something that since I actually took your course, I've started to come across more and more, maybe because I was just more interested in learning about it and sort of incorporating it into, my own practices. But also when you have conversations or when you see some of the strategies that are out there, you're starting to see a massive focus being given to sustainable investing. So what I would like to do is I would like for you to just provide a bit of a 101, a beginner's course on what sustainable investing is, and if we can just speak a little bit about ESG as well and how that fits into it.
Sure. Well, first of all, sustainable investing today is very different than what it was even 5 or 10 years ago, and certainly, barely has any resemblance to what it was in its origins. Right. So originally, this was an investment philosophy that essentially sought to avoid what many investors would define as sin stocks.
So negative screening, essentially.
Negative screening, exactly. Yep. Remove, stocks that are frowned upon, often from a values or ethical or religious perspective, right? So,
right.
Tobacco because it kills people, alcohol because it's not allowed in certain religion, also causes health problems. Gambling because it's bad for people and humans. Obviously, weapons or controversial weapons in particular, cluster munitions and so on. For some, it also included the GMO, genetically modified food, right? Which is very unpopular in Europe, although it's more acceptable here in North America. So that's how things started, and that's how naturally, if you look at a finance from a basic perspective, if you reduce your investment opportunity set, which is what negative screening exactly does, then you achieve suboptimal outcome over time, right. and that means risk-adjusted returns could be less, even though it's only marginally so. But yeah, they're not optimized. As time has passed, we are now in a completely different phase of this notion of sustainable investing. The term sustainability itself refers to longevity and survival, right? And so that's exactly where we are. The view that sustainable investors take today, or let's say investors that seek to develop sustainable strategies, has gone way beyond negative screening, right? Negative screening may, in some cases, remain part of the policy mix, but it's a very minor step, because at the end of the day, a lot of those companies that fit that sin stock definition are there's a small number of, there aren't that many of them around, right? It's all these industries are a fairly small portion of the economy, with the exception of tobacco, and especially in certain developing countries. But so where we are today, it's really, and the reason that sustainable investing has made all the strides it has in recent years, it is not because investors have suddenly discovered, what is right and wrong, or that they should, sort of bear more responsibility to society, even if that's what they often say. I'm cynical enough to understand that human behavior does not change, and human nature, if it ever evolves, will do so over millennia or longer, not over 10 or 20 or 30 years. So it has nothing to do with investors today being somehow more conscientious than investors 30 or 40 years ago. It simply has to do with money, with risk and return, right? At the end of the day, investing is about risk and return, right? And so where we are today is that investors have started to recognize that there are certain types of risks and opportunities that have historically not been given their fair share or not been recognized or understood. And that's where ESG comes in, environmental, social, and governance factors. And not only that, but that those, especially environmental and social factors, or at least some of them, are increasingly material and relevant to a company's profits. And this is where the tie-in to climate comes in, right? So climate change today is a much more dominant reality of our lives than it was 30, 40 years ago, even though it was understood then, right? I mean, scientists and many corporate leaders understood, but for whatever reason, it wasn't pursued, mostly because of the lobbying from oil and gas companies. Now we understand at a much wider and deeper scale the extent, magnitude, and magnitude of climate change and its material effect on corporate profits, and that's the bottom line. And then not only that risk aspect of it, right, but also the opportunities that come from climate change, right? And it's not just renewable energy; it's adaptation technologies, right? If we're going to be dealing with more heat, then well, let's produce air conditioners, and that's going to cool things off. Let's produce electric cars because we can't use oil and gas anymore. So there are tremendous opportunities, right? And then the social aspect, of course, was highlighted more by the pandemic. The fact that we've all lived through this over the last year and a half, and how companies treat their employees during this period, and the extensive forbearance they showed, and tolerance to people's work-life balance, and so on. At the end of the day, the S is quite closely linked to the E. Climate change will cause mass migration. Already is. Right. There's an argument that crop failure in parts of the Middle East in 2010 led to some of the unrest that we saw in that Arab Spring. Right. We're going to see forced migration, and so that's a social problem, right? And that means people will move to countries that are wealthier, and that's going to affect those countries' politics. We're seeing that already, right? And then you see more of the local aspect of the S in terms of equality and diversity and inclusion, which is, today, of course, a very serious part of the conversation for any business leader or investor. So that's kind of a quick 101 of ESG or sustainable investing and where we are.
Right. So essentially, we're taking the lens of the ESG, environmental, social governance, and we're taking a look at the company's actions across each of these factors, and then we're essentially using the outcome of their actions across these three different buckets as part of your fundamental analysis to arrive at what sort of value proposition does this company provide you, and how do those earnings get impacted? What are the ESG risk factors, and then based on that, you make your decisions. So one of the and we had briefly spoken about this before we actually started the podcast, but this may not be a criticism at the moment, but would it be fair to say that at one point in time, there was the idea that if you were to use ESG, that it could potentially take away from maximizing your returns? But when we actually take a look at how ESG funds have performed and how companies that do bring in these ESG considerations in their actions, in that investing in these organizations or having that ESG lens actually leads to outperformance versus conventional investing strategies.
Yeah, you're right. Originally there was this perception that sustainable investing or ESG investing somehow led to leaving money on the table.
Right.
It is clear that it's exactly the opposite now. If you disregard, those factors, material factors, and in the end of the day, it's about materiality, right? Materiality means any kind of factor that affects your profits in a material way, right?
Yep.
So today we have arrived at a stage where not taking ESG into consideration more often than not will actually result in suboptimal performance. There are numerous studies that have been done on this from the academic perspective. In my class, you probably remember we discussed a paper that looked at, it was kind of a review study, looked at 2,000 studies or so.
I remember.
That concluded unequivocally that, at worst, sustainable investing does not, affect returns negatively. In more case studies than not, it was found to actually have a positive impact. Morgan Stanley did a similar study of 10,000 mutual funds, reached the same conclusion that it's across time, across sectors, applying sustainability strategies lead to higher risk-adjusted returns. And it shouldn't really be a surprise for anyone to see that, right? Because if you understand the drivers behind why investors are paying attention to these things today, then you understand, because these are material factors that actually matter and affect the bottom line. And so, that also contributes to this evolving view of fiduciary duty, right? Because that's one of the excuses that are sometimes used. Well, oh no, it's our fiduciary duty is not to consider any, non-financial factors. Well, these are financial factors.
Absolutely.
Because they affect the bottom line. And so there's the CFA Institute has updated its definition of fiduciary duty to explicitly reference ESG factors as it is a responsibility of a CFA charter holder to take ESG factors into consideration, because that's part of their fiduciary duty.
I don't recall whether or not we had discussed this during the course that I had taken, but I do remember that when we had that case competition that I had gone to, actually the U of T for, the topic was essentially sustainability. And I think it was either during that case competition or perhaps prior to that I came across perhaps credit rating agencies wanting to bring in ESG factors in their grading of companies' ability to repay its debt obligations. Did we move along at all? Are credit rating agencies actually further exploring that?
Yeah, they already have. If you look at Moody's, for example, Moody's bought Visio Iris a couple of years ago, which is a ESG data provider. More recently, they made another major acquisition in the same space. And they are integrating ESG risks into their credit ratings, because they, because it's material, and especially for certain sectors that face, higher exposure, higher risk to some, ESG factors, for example, environmental, then it can affect its ability to repay loans. So if you look at actually the big three, S&P, Fitch, and Moody's, especially S&P and Moody's have made some very interesting strategic acquisitions. S&P bought TrueCost, which is another environmental data provider. They're all positioning themselves to essentially, strategically recognize that ESG risk and opportunity is core to the assessment of the financial health of a company.
Right. So for those who don't necessarily understand the implications of this, so the way it would work is you would have a credit rating agency who provides a grading to organizations, and that grading actually reflects the organization's ability to repay its debt obligations, and that has an implication on their cost of debt. So using that grading that they have, they're able to go to their banks and they say, hey, I've got an investment grade rating, I'm rated AAA, so therefore my cost of debt has to be lower than somebody who's considered to have a higher risk. And now, as these credit rating agencies start to incorporate ESG factors, what a lot of organizations will start to sort of see is that credit rating that their credit rating could potentially take a bit of a correction, and then that would have implications on their cost of debt. So it's a significant impact on an organization's ability to, first of all, raise debt, but then also to service that debt. So it's something that, from an organization standpoint, it's something that they absolutely have to take into consideration. Otherwise, they're dealing with these additional sort of factors. One of the things, and sometimes I get confused as well, is we've got sustainable investing, then we've got socially responsible investing, and then we've got impact investing.
Yeah.
Are these all just one and the same? Does one have more of a focus? Does socially responsible investing have more of a focus on the S? What's the difference?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Short answer is yes. So they do have different approaches. I would say sustainable investing is probably the one that I find the most interesting, because it doesn't kind of restrict itself to any kind of narrow focus.
Yeah.
Socially responsible investing can be a bit misleading, the term, and it's generally regarded as more. It kind of is closer to the older style of SRI, right? It's socially responsible, so
Got it.
more values driven. Sustainable is really, to me, like, even the term ESG, I think it's overused, right? Everybody uses the term. The fact is, yes, environmental and social factors are the core components of sustainability. Governance, of course, is naturally, who wouldn't look at governance,
right?
I mean, any investor that wants to conduct a rigorous fundamental analysis, of course, has to look at how well governed the company is, right? You don't want the CEO with his roommate from college or his golfing buddy sitting on his board, right? You want independent directors that will hold management to account and represent shareholders. That's the role of a board, right?
Yep.
So yeah, the answer to your question is that they're not all the same. Impact investing is, of course, a form of investing that explicitly seeks to measure a social and or environmental impact alongside financial returns. So impact investing is probably the only category of this broader field of sustainable investing, or sometimes SRI is abbreviated as or an abbreviation of sustainable and responsible investing.
Yep.
Okay, so impact is the only field, probably, or style of investing where some, not all, some investors would accept suboptimal returns or below market returns. If you look at the studies published by GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, around 2/3 of impact investors seek to achieve market level returns, financial returns, alongside a measurable impact, environmental or social, whereas 1/3 will accept either below market returns or will seek to only cover the cost of capital.
Got it.
So that's sort of impact investing. So yeah, they're not all the same, and you can look up different strategies. The easiest way for anybody who wants to understand the difference is to look up some of the products or indices that exist from, let's say, Dow Jones Sustainability Indices or MSCI indices. They contain multitude of ESG investment styles,
right?
And they're self-explanatory, more or less.
And when we think about the flow of funds and returns, I was reading recently, and I thought it made sense to me, but I wanted to get your opinion on it. Investors and the flow of funds, when you're talking specifically about sustainable investing opportunities, and when we talk about emerging markets would, of course, provide several investing opportunities for investors who are looking for those green opportunities, if you want to call them. But at the same time, we're starting to see, or we have been seeing, emerging markets also be more susceptible and more at risk to a lot of these climate change events that are taking place. So if of course, if that happens, then their GDP gets impacted. If their GDP gets impacted, then their ability to repay investors and provide investors with those returns takes a bit of a beating. Do you see that being a challenge for emerging markets and the flow of funds perhaps being redirected to other areas where that climate change risk is perhaps a lot lower?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, it is a challenge if they kind of, if any emerging economy does not recognize um, the game-changing nature of what's taking place right now in the world of finance and in the world of business as a whole, right? You're seeing whole industries transform, right? I mean, the car industry is totally transforming. In 10 years, it's going to look unrecognizable to where it is today, right? The energy sector is transforming, utilities. So if I'm an emerging economy today and I'm missing out on all these game-changing developments, and if I don't realize that the biggest emerging economy of all, China, is actually leading many of these developments and transformations, as a leader in these technologies, then yeah, I'm going to definitely be left out. And so that's I think a matter for policymakers in emerging economies. But what's encouraging is to see how many of them, I mean, obviously all of them have signed up to the Paris Agreement, but many central banks, for example, have signed up to the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System.
Yeah.
So you see that there is actually a fairly sophisticated recognition among emerging market, at least some or many, I would say, emerging market policymakers, that sustainable finance is not something to sort of hold your breath and hope it goes away. It's something that is transformative and game changing, and if they're smart, then they'll play a role. And the other aspect of the emerging market role in this, today you hear net zero commitments by governments and or corporates as they're a dime a dozen, right? I mean, today, who doesn't have a net zero commitment, right? Including many energy companies, for now the European ones, but Americans are pressured to do the same. Emerging economies can have an important role to play because net zero is almost impossible to achieve without offsets, carbon offsets, right? Meaning, you if you can't reduce your own emissions to zero as a company or as a country, then you invest somewhere else where you can reduce emissions in that place.
Exactly.
And pretty much that's an emerging economy, right?
Yep.
Of course, this has a history because the Europeans have been doing this with their emissions trading scheme for 20 years or so, and it has a history of misuse and corruption and investing in non-existent projects and these kind of things. So there's a very serious effort underway right now to kind of legitimize our offsets market. And if I'm an emerging economy policymaker, I would take a serious look at that and see how my country can benefit.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to ask you, so looking forward to the climate change conference that's supposed to be taking place, I believe the one in Glasgow, is that in October or November or somewhere around then?
Yeah, exactly.
COP26. What do you think comes out of that? Are there any coordinated action items you think will come out of that, or is that just going to be more of the same, just discussing the report and just conveying that this is something that of course a lot of you can't ignore the situation. You can't ignore, and you have to basically put in place certain systems and policies that will help to reduce these emissions.
Well, I mean, in this in the world of sustainability or sustainable policy and sustainable investing and so on, the Glasgow conference is a big deal.
Okay.
And the expectation is that there will be concrete policy measures announced, and something around net zero, coordination among economies, because you have essentially every major economy pretty much in the world today has committed to a net zero, including China,
right?
At a later date, but they've also committed. Canada, United States, European Union, of course. So the expectation is that some kind of major policy announcement will come out of it. Of course, what we will not see is what we need the most, which is some kind of global carbon price, right? And that's not going to happen. But that is the most effective way to deal with this at this point. The question is not what's going to come out of the conference. I think there's so many expectations, so much momentum, so much pressure to deliver some concrete policy. The question is what happens the day after the conference, right? Is will they be implemented? What will that look like? How long will it take? And what's the ultimate effect? So I think that's what will be like kind of the debrief after is what would be we should pay close attention to. But yeah, I think this is probably definitely I would say the most important COP since the Paris COP in 2015.
Got it. I wanted to come back to the global carbon price. If you could just speak a little bit more to that. And then also, if you could just touch on what carbon credits are and the role that they have to play.
Yeah, so by carbon credits, you mean what I referred to as carbon offsets earlier?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of, sorry, can you repeat the first question?
Yeah, so just if you could just speak a little bit more about this global carbon price.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I mean, the economists have pretty much agree that the most efficient way to have the market play a role in changing consumer behavior is to put a price on any factor that is not priced. Right now, it's an externality, right? So it means it has a cost on the economy that is not priced into the product or service today, right? So putting a carbon price means either you tax carbon directly, which is what, for example, British Columbia does, or and what the federal backstop is. The federal backstop in Canada, I don't want to get too much into the politics and confuse people, but essentially what the federal government in Canada says to every province is if you don't have a credible mechanism in place to reduce carbon emissions in line with Canada's targets, for the Paris Agreement, then the federal government will impose on you its own mechanism, which is essentially a carbon price.
Right.
So that carbon price right now is $40 a ton. It's going to increase to $50 next year, and the current government has announced that it intends to raise that price to $170 by the end of this decade.
Per unit of emissions.
Per ton of what we call per ton of CO2 equivalent, right? Meaning, per ton of CO2. If it's not CO2, then whatever the equivalent of 1 ton of CO2 is for that gas.
Got it.
So right now, like I said, that's putting a direct tax on it is what British Columbia does, and any province that is not in compliance with the federal rules has that imposed on it by the federal government. And most of these policies actually result in or the most effective of them would result in would be revenue neutral, meaning any revenue collected from that tax is returned to taxpayers, like British Columbia does, in the form of a personal income tax cut. And actually, British Columbia, since it implemented its carbon price in 2008, has had faster GDP growth per capita than the rest of Canada, and has now the lowest income tax rate in Canada, lowest provincial income tax rate in Canada, and has reduced its carbon emissions faster than any other province in Canada. So tick all three boxes right there. Carbon tax works, right? But the problem, of course, is that tax is a lot of people are allergic to the word tax. A lot of politicians, in particular, are hypocritically allergic to the word tax. So they would rather use these obscure regulations and things that consumers can't see or taxpayers can't see, but ultimately are less effective and cost the economy more, which means it costs us all more.
Right.
The other mechanism to regulate carbon emissions is cap and trade system, which is what we have in Quebec, and that's what the European Union does as well, and what China has also launched at scale this year. And this is where essentially you look at the most polluting industries, polluting meaning highest carbon emitters, and you allocate permits to companies in that industry. And of course, the most effective way is to have an auction rather than give it away. And so you essentially, as a company, let's say you're a cement manufacturer, you join the auction, you bid, you buy the permits that allow you to emit carbon. And in order for those emissions to be reduced over time, the number of permits sold every year have to decline. Decrease over time. And of course, the price goes up as well over time. And then there's a secondary market. That's why it's called cap and trade.
Correct.
Right? So you sell them, you trade them. So if somebody else can reduce emissions more efficiently or cheaper than you, then you can just buy it from them. And the opposite is true. If you're very efficient and you have, a way to reduce your emissions in a way that results in surplus permits, then you sell them. You actually make money from it.
So what happens to those organizations that aren't able to get their hands on a permit?
Well, then you're facing fines, right? I mean, you have to have it's like any other industry regulation. If you're not in compliance, then you face fines, and ultimately it's going to cost you more.
But I would imagine that the number of permits must in some way, shape, or form correlate to the number of organizations that they. Okay.
Yeah, of course, right? Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of it's top down in the sense that its design is top down. So you see, okay, these are the emissions we have today in the industry.
Yeah.
These are the emissions that would be consistent with our objective as an economy, and by 2030, let's say. And so that's the path to, today we emit, let's say 100, by 2030, we need to emit 50. So we're going to reduce the allocation every year accordingly. So what that means is the price will keep going up because they become more scarce.
Yeah.
And companies that continue to emit, well, then you're squeezing them because at some point the cost is so high that it makes sense for them, let's say, to invest in scrubbers to reduce emissions coming out of their exhaust pipes, whatever. I'm just kind of giving a theoretical example.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Or alternatively, what it could do, and I'm just thinking out loud here, is it could potentially just increase M&A activity. So you would have, large companies that, in order to meet that requirement, would perhaps just take over other organizations and then that way have access to more permits. I don't know if it would work like that or not.
Well, you're right, and this is kind of this is the role of the marketplace, right? Which is you put the policy in place and you let the market decide, right? So you're going to have innovations. One of if you look at Tesla, for example, the reason that Tesla is making money today, it's not because it's selling cars. Tesla is making money from selling these carbon credits, which you referred to earlier, right? So essentially, you have companies like GM and Ford and so on buying from Tesla emissions permits.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And is that regulated, that secondary market? Like, do regulators go in and say that's the max you can sell these credits for, or is it like
the secondary market is a free market, so it's supply and demand. Regulators, they set usually, like for example in Quebec, regulators will set a floor price for the auction.
Okay.
Right. So the federal floor now is $40 a ton this year. Which means any auction in Quebec cannot settle for less than $40 a ton.
Right. Yeah. So in a way, you're controlling how expensive you want the credits to be by keeping that minimum level.
Yeah. Exactly.
Question on the net zero. You mentioned that a lot of governments have committed to that. Is that net zero commitment? Is it a pipe dream, or are we seeing countries actually either hit that or get close to it?
Well, net zero commitments are pretty much targeted for 2050. So we're
working
29 years away from that.
Yeah.
But having said that, they're achievable, right? It is achievable. You can see a path towards that.
Yeah.
But it requires some drastic policy changes starting right now, and this is why. For many policymakers, for many investors in this space, 2030 is really the year to pay attention to, right? Because that's, and again, the IPCC report confirms that, right? That's the year where we will likely know whether we have, still a chance to achieve to limit warming to 1.5 or if it's too late.
Yeah.
And so that means, policies need to be put in place today. You can't say, okay, in 2050, we'll achieve net zero, but the person making that declaration is going to be dead or retired by then.
Exactly.
So that means, in order for those policies to be credible, you need to reverse engineer it and work backwards 29 years.
Yep.
Right. And see, okay, what is the path? What is the scenario by which we arrive there?
Yep. Honestly, this topic is fascinating. I could continue asking questions for several hours. It's something that I'm extremely passionate about, just because it's hard for you to not it's hard for you to ignore it, right? Like, we're living in it. We're seeing the effects of climate change on a daily basis. I mean, we've got heat waves here that have lasted for the longest time. I have family in Seattle, and they were mentioning that apparently it's been there's a heat wave there as well, and it's been the worst it's been in the longest time. We're starting to see these. We're living in it, so it's hard for us to ignore it. But I would like to say, I'd like to thank you for being on the show. It's I'm always excited and always happy to speak about both of these topics, climate change as well as sustainable investing. So thank you for taking the time, and I would like to have you down in the future, and perhaps we could see what progress we've made over the course of that time.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Abdullah. And I would say, one thing people should keep an eye on is what kind of disclosure rules we're going to see in the coming months in the United States and in Canada, in the sustainable investing space. Right, that's one thing to keep an eye on, because regulators are taking a very serious look at disclosure. Disclosing your exposure to climate change, disclosing your policies to for sustainable funds. If you are a sustainable fund, how are you actually making it sustainable? So just keep an eye on this disclosure space, and maybe that's a topic we can talk about another time.
Awesome.
But yeah, my pleasure. And you're a very good moderator and interviewer, so it's a pleasure to be on your show.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm still working on it. But yeah, no, great speaking with you. And for all of those who are listening and tuning in, thank you once again for joining us. This is of course, if you like what we spoke about, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share. And this is the Topical Minds podcast. My name is Abdullah Kulfaro, and I will see you on the next one.